Today, high heels are symbols of fashion, of elegance, of femininity. They lengthen posture, change gait, alter silhouette. Entire industries revolve around them. They appear in offices, on red carpets, at weddings, in boardrooms. But high heels were not invented for women. They were not designed for beauty. They were built for war. In the 10th century, Persian cavalry soldiers wore heeled boots to help them stand securely in their stirrups while shooting arrows on horseback. The raised heel locked the rider's foot in place, allowing him to rise slightly and fire with stability. The shoe was not decorative. It was functional. It was military equipment. So how did a tool of mounted archers become one of the most gendered items in modern fashion? To answer that, we have to step into the Persian Empire, onto the battlefield, and then into the royal courts of Europe, where power, masculinity, and status were performed not just through weapons, but through shoes. Before high heels were fashion, they were technology. And before they symbolized femininity, they symbolized power. Persian cavalry, why heels were military technology. In the 9th and 10th centuries, Persian cavalry units were among the most formidable mounted forces in the region. Mounted archery required balance, precision, and stability. A rider often needed to rise slightly in the saddle to shoot accurately while the horse was in motion. Without secure footing, that movement was dangerous. The heel solved a practical problem. By adding a raised block at the back of the shoe, the rider's foot could lock into the stirrup. The heel prevented the foot from sliding forward, anchoring the body during rapid turns or when drawing a bow. It was not about height, it was about control. Heeled riding boots became associated with elite cavalrymen, soldiers who were not only warriors, but symbols of imperial strength. In Persia, horsemanship was a mark of nobility. To ride well was to belong to a higher social class. The heel therefore carried meaning. It signaled that the wearer was mounted, armed, elevated, literally and socially. The shoe became tied to status and masculinity. But this technology did not remain confined to Persia. In the early 17th century, diplomatic exchanges between Persia and European courts brought more than political alliances. They brought style, and European aristocrats were watching closely. In the late 16th and early 17th centuries, Persia sought alliances against a common rival, the Ottoman Empire. Persian diplomats traveled to European courts, particularly in France and other parts of Western Europe. Along with political proposals, they brought visual spectacle, elaborate textiles, refined tailoring, and distinctive riding boots with raised heels. European aristocrats were fascinated. At the time, horseback riding was already associated with nobility. Peasants walked, laborers worked the fields, but the elite rode. When European noblemen adopted the Persian-style heeled shoe, they were not borrowing fashion for comfort, they were borrowing symbolism. The heel signaled that the wearer was a man of rank, someone who commanded horses, land, and armies. By the mid-1600s, heels became fashionable in royal courts across Europe. The higher and more ornate the heel, the clearer the message. I do not labor. I do not walk long distances. I belong to a class that rides. One of the most famous adopters was Louis XIV of France. Louis was not tall, but he wore red-heeled shoes, often decorated and elevated, turning footwear into a visible statement of authority. Red heels became restricted to members of his court. In this moment, the heel was not feminine, it was masculine spectacle. But that meaning would not last. The gender shift, when heels crossed the line. By the late 17th century, something unusual began to happen. Women in European courts started wearing heels too. At first, this was not a rejection of masculinity, it was imitation. Aristocratic women often adopted elements of male fashion to signal status. Heels were associated with power, nobility, and authority. To wear them was to borrow that symbolism. But subtle differences emerged. Men's heels were thick, practical, tied to riding culture. Women's heels gradually became narrower, more decorative, less functional. Over time, fashion began to exaggerate the difference. By the early 18th century, European menswear shifted towards restraint. The Enlightenment promoted ideals of rationality and simplicity. Ornate clothing on men began to fade. Heels shortened, thickened, and eventually disappeared from male fashion. For women, the opposite occurred. Heels became slimmer, higher, more stylized. By the late 1870s, heels were largely absent from men's wardrobes, but increasingly associated with femininity. A military technology had crossed into aristocratic performance and then into gendered identity. The same raised block that once stabilized a warrior now shaped the posture and gait of women in court. Power had changed hands, but the shoe remained. Industrialization, reinventing the heel. By the 19th century, high heels largely disappeared from everyday European fashion. The French Revolution had reshaped attitudes towards aristocratic excess. Ornate court styles fell out of favor. Simplicity replaced spectacle. For a time, the heel nearly vanished. But in the late 1800s and early 1900s, industrial manufacturing transformed footwear. Mass production made shoes cheaper, more varied, and more experimental. At the same time, photography and cinema began reshaping beauty standards. Heels returned, but not as symbols of mounted nobility. They became tools of visual exaggeration. A raised heel tilts the pelvis forward. It lengthens the leg line. It alters posture and gait. Designers began emphasizing slender, elevated shapes. By the 1950s, the stiletto heel emerged, thin, sharp, dramatically high. This version had no military function. It offered no stability in stirrups. It was designed for aesthetic impact. Advertising reframed the heel as elegance, glamour, attraction. The symbolism had fully shifted. Once a marker of elite masculinity, then aristocratic power, the heel was now marketed almost exclusively as feminine allure. A weapon of cavalry had become a performance of beauty. But the transformation reveals something deeper than fashion. It reveals how power moves. Hidden legacy, what the heel still carries. High heels did not begin as decoration. They began as equipment, a practical solution to a battlefield problem. They locked a soldier into position. They stabilized power in motion. They signaled rank from a distance. Even today, high heels modify stance and gait in ways that communicate something: confidence, authority, formality, attraction. The same object once used to anchor a warrior now shapes modern identity. Fashion often feels superficial, but beneath it are layers of history: war, diplomacy, hierarchy, rebellion. High heels are not simply shoes. They are fossils of power. A reminder that what we wear can begin on the battlefield and end on the runway.